I'll try to move quickly through this material. A study of the SPPA data from 1992 determined that arts education was the single most powerful predictor of adult arts attendance, and we began our work with that finding. We had three fundamental research questions, and if you'll move to the next slide, please. To the next slide, please. Jeez. Okay, there we go. Our research questions were, first, is arts education consistently the strongest predictor of adult arts participation across all of the SPPAs? Second, what are the trends over time in arts education? Has it increased or decreased across the years of the SPPAs? And third, has childhood arts education contributed to or mitigated declining adult arts participation, and in particular, declining adult arts attendance? If I can have the next slide, please. Okay, so our first question. Let's move quickly to the next slide. The SPPAs included questions about whether people had classes or lessons in childhood and as adults. And we found that those who had had classes were far more likely to report that they had attended the arts in the last year. The graph that you can see on the left shows that those who reported that they'd had classes as children, that of those who reported that they'd had classes as children, nearly 60% reported that they had also attended at least one arts event over the last year. But only about a quarter of those who did not have classes as children reported attending. The graph on the right shows that there's an even stronger association of attendance with adult classes across all the surveys. If you can move to the next slide, please. For the purpose of determining the significance of arts education relative to other factors that are also positively associated with adult arts attendance, we created a hypothetical person who we named BP. We deliberately assigned a set of characteristics to BP that made him less likely than the average adult to participate in the arts. BP is not designed to be a typical American, but a useful statistical baseline. He's white and he's male. He's between 18 and 24 years of age. He's had no arts education as a child or as an adult. He had a high school education, as did his parents. He's married and he works, but he's in the lowest socioeconomic quartile. Now, with BP as our baseline, we changed variables one by one while holding all the others constant to make a judgment about the relative strength of each. And we can see on the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. We can see on this slide that the likelihood of BP attending the arts has declined with each successive SPPA wave, from 12.5% in 1982 to 8.8% in 2008. The decline, of course, reflects the overall decline in adult attendance over the course of the SPPAs. Next slide. In this slide, you can see that the difference that more education makes to the likelihood of BP attending the arts. The graph on the left shows that adding some college, not a degree, but some college, to BP's high school education increases the chances that he will attend the arts from 8.8 to 12.7%, a rise in the rate of about 44%. A college degree or higher would increase the chance that he'd attend the arts by 108%. The graphs to the right show the smaller influence that his parents' education has over the likelihood of his attending the arts. There is some influence, but it's not very strong. Next slide, please. These graphs show the effects of more arts education in childhood. That's the graph on the left. And in adulthood on the right. In each graph, BP is over on the left at 8.8%, the short green bar. The next bar represents what happens to attendance if BP takes classes or lessons in just one art form. The effect of that class, if taken in childhood, is to raise the chance of BP attending the arts from 8.8 to 12.5%, nearly as much as some college. classes or lessons in 4 forms as a child would increase the chance of attendance to almost 24%, more than a 4-year or postgraduate degree. Classes in adulthood have an even more substantial effect, as you might expect. Next slide, please. Here's another way of expressing the same thing. This table exhibits the odds ratios of attending an arts event associated with units of childhood arts education. In other words, classes or lessons in each of the several art forms or creative writing. Each one of those is a unit of arts education. And with adult arts education and with educational attainment. 3 lessons in childhood yields a higher odds ratio of attendance than a 4-year college degree or higher. 1 lesson in adulthood yields a higher odds ratio than some college, and 2 lessons in adulthood yields a higher odds ratio than a 4-year degree or more. It's on this basis that we believe it is fair to say that arts education is the most powerful predictor of adult arts attendance. No other measurable variable had a larger impact on adult attendance than taking lessons in 3 art forms as a child or 2 as an adult. Next slide. What are the trends in arts education over time? Well, many of us who have been involved in arts education over the past decades have believed that there has been a sustained erosion of childhood arts education in the country for some time. But we've had actually quite little hard national data to back up the claim. Next slide. This graph shows that the proportion of responding 18-year-olds in successive SPPA surveys reported that they had arts education as children, that proportion has declined with each SPPA from a high of about 65% in 1982 to a low of under 50% in 2008. The absolute decline of 15% was nearly a quarter of the proportion that had arts classes as children in 1982. As you can see in the graph, the slope or the pace of the decline is increasing. And there is no sign that the decline will not continue. I want to point out at this point that the data points on the graph are set at the years of each SPPA, but that they represent arts education for the 17 years before the date on the chart, the childhood years of the 18-year-olds who reported whether or not they had taken classes or lessons. These data show that the decline began prior to the passage of No Child Left Behind, but the pace has increased since it was passed in 2002. I suggest that these data are significant substantiation of the claim that childhood arts education has declined over the last 3 decades. But what happened before the SPPAs began in 1982? Can I have the next slide? Thanks. Since the panel of SPPA respondents was a representative sample, it included older Americans in every survey. Someone who was 70 years old in 1982 was born in 1912, and their responses to whether they had taken classes or lessons in childhood gave us for the first time data that indicated what proportion of young Americans had any arts education in 1930. In fact, that 1930 is the year that those 70-year-olds turned 18. In fact, we can trace the proportion of children who had any arts education from 1930 all the way through 2008, and that's what this graph shows. Childhood arts education rose across most of the 20th century before declining in its final decades. The solid line shows the trend in the proportion of Americans who reported that they had any childhood arts education from across those years, 1930 to 2008. The solid line, otherwise known as the best fit line, represents the trend across those years by smoothing the irregularities of the data. The graph shows that arts education rose steadily from 1930, the first year that the data included a statistically reliable sample size, when slightly over 20% of children had any arts education. By about 1972, half of American children were receiving some arts education, and the percentage continued to rise until about 1985, when it began to decline. It crossed the 50% threshold again in about 2000, this time moving downward. And by 2008, it had retreated to roughly the level it was at in 1965. What might explain this decline? The fairly dramatic turn downward was probably precipitated by two things. The first was widespread resistance to taxes for public services like education, beginning with the passage of Proposition 13 in California, and fiscal crises in most of the major districts across the country in the late 1970s and 1980s. Prop 13 was passed in California in 1978. The second was the emergence of school reform as a high national priority with the publication of the Nation at Risk report in 1983, which charged that our schools were suffering a rising tide of mediocrity and launched enormous efforts, still ongoing, focused on raising standards and testing. Arts education was barely mentioned by the report, and it has been consistently marginalized in school reform ever since. We wanted to understand how the decline has been distributed among American children. If you go to the next slide, please. Whoops. Okay, go to the next slide, too. Yes, here we are. We wanted to look at how the decline was distributed across American children. And this slide shows that arts education has actually declined only slightly for white children. That's the green line at the top. The decline has been concentrated heavily among African American, the black line with the triangles, and Hispanic children, the gray line with the circles, which are both down very substantially. Move to the next slide, please. When we look at the art forms that people have studied over time in this slide, we can see that the bulk of the decline has been concentrated in music. That's the green line at the top, down from 53% to 37%, and in visual art, down the dotted green line below music, down from 36 to 26%. And actually, dance and theater recorded very slight gains from 1982 to 2008. The fifth line, creative writing, is also down quite sharply, but didn't start nearly as high as music and visual art. Now, children, of course, get arts education from a variety of sources. Can we move to the next slide? They get art education in schools, they get it at home, and they get it in the community. And the pattern that we see in those last two slides, the pattern of distribution by race and the pattern of distribution by art form, suggests that the decline has been concentrated in schools because music and visual arts are the two art forms most taught in schools. The pattern among racial groups, if you'll move to the next slide, demonstrates that the decline has been sharpest in schools that serve low-income minority children. It would appear that cuts to schools that serve predominantly white children have either been smaller or that their parents have found other sources of arts education for their children. Our last research question, the next slide, was, has the decline in arts education contributed to the declining adult arts attendance? And on the face of it, I think we would have to say that the cuts probably have contributed, but, next slide please. There are surely many other factors at work that contribute to the decline. For one thing, education policies who have made the arts a low priority don't believe that they're of great educational value. But we don't fully understand the reasons that they don't understand why they believe that. There may be a general and growing disinterest in the arts that led them to the conclusion that the arts were not terribly important in education. In other words, causality may be bidirectional. It's not clear that attendance will rise if children got more arts education. The SPPA data is very coarse-grained. the effects of arts education are likely to depend on the kind, the quality, the intensity, and the longevity of arts education experience and other factors that we just don't have data on. All American children study math. Some students are inspired to pursue further learning in math, and some take a lifelong or professional interest in math or related subjects. But studying math in childhood certainly does not have that effect on all children. Some math education experiences may drive students away from mathematical thinking and learning. And I think we have to assume that the same may be the case for some arts education experiences as well. Finally, it's important to understand from the perspective of arts advocacy and arts education advocacy that concerns about arts attendance are not going to drive education policy. In fact, from the perspective of education policy, it would strike me that the concerns of arts advocates are likely to be considered rather trivial. The case for arts education will need to be driven by practical arguments and good research on the contributions that arts education makes to student learning and development in general. There's a growing body of excellent research on which to build that case, but I do think that it's clear that far more is needed. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. So with that, and you can see that Nick has presented a variety of policy implications as well as future research topics, but I think most people will agree that the findings are noteworthy, to say the least. I would invite you to keep submitting questions. Just type into the box that should have appeared in your control panel. Meanwhile, we do have one question. Nick, the question is, did your research review the types of arts classes experienced? Now, you did show a slide, I know, that showed that. Could you just review what those were, what types of art forms you're talking about when we talk about arts classes or lessons?
Yes, the SPPAs routinely ask questions about what art form people took classes or lessons in. In other words, were they in the visual arts, music, dance, theater, or creative writing? In some of the surveys, they also asked whether the classes or lessons were taken in school or out of school, but some of the surveys did not include those questions. So the data was not comparable across all of the surveys, and we lacked good data about whether the classes were taken in school or out of school on all of the surveys. And it didn't include any questions about the intensity, the longevity, or the level at which the classes were taken. So it is, as I said, coarse-grained data. Someone might have answered, for example, yes to the question of music lessons or classes as a child if they had taken 5 years of private piano lessons for an hour a week and practiced an hour a day, every day. They could also have answered yes if they had taken 1 semester of recorder lessons in 4th grade with their class in school. The answer, we only had access to the answer yes or no. So this is coarse-grained data, and it would do us, I think, a world of good to have much more fine-grained data.
And I have to say here that Nick has made very consistent and articulate recommendations about how we might adjust the survey going forward to perhaps capture better grained data, as he says, on the extent to which people participate through arts education. And we've taken into consideration some of those ideas for our future survey that we'll conduct in 2012, which we can talk about at the end. So there are many more questions. Let me just go through a few of them. There's a question, and I think you've kind of answered this, Nick. How is childhood arts education defined? And I think we've made it clear that it was in terms of having taken a class or lesson in one of those art forms, either as a child or as an adult. And depending on which findings Nick showed you, he was referring to either childhood arts education or adult arts education. And because we have 4 or 5 survey periods we're talking about, not every survey year consistently asked whether it was in school or out of school. So we're doing the best we can with that data. Nick, do you want to add anything to this idea of how do we define arts education?
No, I think that covers it pretty well, Sunil. Thanks.
Somebody has a question. Do the relationships you have illustrated hold with equal force in all regions of the U.S., East versus West versus Midwest versus South? And I'll step in here because I know Nick will say that the data actually do not drill down to that level of geographic specificity. I'm going to stumble on that word. Largely because of the sample size. While 18,000 adults is still a lot by any standard, we couldn't drill down enough into those areas. However, we did look at regional differences, and we actually have a research report, a research note on our website, arts.gov/research. If you go to the research notes, one of them does talk about state and regional differences in arts participation. So it doesn't drill down probably to the level that we'd all like, but it does talk about some basic regional variations. Could there be emerging genres or artistic disciplines that are not represented in this data of declining attendance? Nick?
Yeah, of course there are. I think what comes most quickly to mind is media arts, film, video, and recorded sound, animation, which I think many people might have responded in one of the art forms that are asked about. They might have, for example, a kid who takes an animation class might report, yes, I've taken a visual art class, but it's not entirely clear. The fact of the matter is, of course, the arts change very quickly, and arts education changes with them, and there are always new forms in developing.
Right, and one of the questions we've got actually relates to a kind of a growing concern for us in how we track this information going forward. It's saying if classes in school contained fine arts studies within them, was that counted, or were those questions specifying arts-only courses? And of course, we're obviously following very closely movements to do arts integration in other curricula, and I have to say that the study does not ask about having taken classes in other subjects other than those that we named within the arts. Now, somebody could have reported yes if, say, they took a music class and it was really part of, say, a class on math and it included a musical component, say. Then it's up to the respondent whether or not they counted that themselves as an arts class, as a music class. So those are just some examples, but that's just one example, rather. But that's an area we also want to look at. Do you have any thoughts about arts integration there, Nick?
Well, I think it's a tough question to ask people on a survey because it's a nuanced issue, and it's a relatively new phenomenon in American schools. So most kids those kids, and there probably are not that many of them anyway, who are in classes that are what we might refer to as arts integrated classes, by the time they're adults might not even think of them, might not respond to a question, did you ever have an arts integrated class? Might not know that the class was, quote, arts integrated. Tricky business on a survey.